Welcome to Book Lounge by Libby. My name is Joe, and I'm so happy you're here. Before we dive into this episode of Book Lounge, just want to take a quick moment to say thank you for checking out the show. Please consider following or subscribing, or even just a comment on YouTube or Spotify. It makes a huge difference. Thank you. I hope you've got your hot dogs, flip-flops, and fireworks ready. The 4th of July is just days away, and today I'm joined by two wonderful folks from President Lincoln's Cottage to talk about the work they're doing to celebrate America 250. Joining me are Callie Hawkins, Executive Director, and Cameron Walpole, Associate Director of Interpretation and Public Programs. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Joe. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you both here. To get us started, if you could both just say hi and your name for our audio-only listeners so they can meet your voices, and just share the first book that comes to mind.
Hi, I'm Callie Hawkins. I'm the Executive Director at President Lincoln's Cottage, and a book that I try to read every year or two is Anne of Green Gables. It's a staple of my childhood and one of my very favorites.
And I'm Cameron Walpole, and the book that immediately comes to mind for me is East of Eden by John Steinbeck, which I also try to read every few years.
Jonathan Steinbeck as a reread every few years is devious work, Cameron. I mean, it's great work, but like, whew, okay, you're gonna hit me with Steinbeck.
It's a lot.
We're recording on a Monday, y'all, and to be confronted by Steinbeck at noon. It's noon. I've been up for hours at this point. It's fine. Well, thank you to you both. I love both of those titles, and I think it speaks so well to the work you do because there's so much thought behind both of them. And I love to meet fellow rereaders because it feels like more and more that's like one of my hot takes that I'm over here rereading books I've, loved forever. Now, for listeners who may not be familiar with President Lincoln's Cottage, what is it? Why is it such an important place in understanding Lincoln beyond the image on the penny or the Lincoln Memorial?
That's a great question. It's one of my favorite things to actually talk about with visitors who may know so much about the Lincoln story, but are maybe a little less familiar with the cottage. The cottage is located in Washington, D.C., and it was the seasonal home for the Lincoln family for a quarter of Lincoln's presidency. So they lived here from roughly June to November of 1862, 63, and 64. They, made plans to come out here the first hot season Lincoln was president. We're away from downtown. It's, about 3.5, 4 miles away from the White House, and we're up on a hilltop. And they made plans to come out the first hot season he was president, but Fort Sumter happened. Lincoln knew he needed to stay downtown. But by the summer of 1862, the family was really reeling from the death of their little boy, Willie, and just kind of needed a quiet place to grieve together as a family. So they moved out here to the cottage. It's on the grounds of a retirement home for veterans. And so there was this community of people already living out here. But it was sort of this respite away from the hubbub of downtown D.C. And within just a few short weeks of moving here, Lincoln put pen to paper on the Emancipation Proclamation, which he crafted in an upstairs bedroom. So it's an incredibly significant part of the Lincoln story. And really, I think, when we think about the fact that our homes are the most intimate spaces that we occupy, this, I think, held a special sort of place in time for the Lincolns, and was somewhere he did his best thinking and certainly his best work.
Absolutely. That was actually going to be my leading question of like, this was the spot of some of his most consequential thinking while staying at the cottage. And he had to go through so much in the world, but also personally, as you shared. As the two of you, work within the cottage and spend time around there, what are the emotions, feelings, thoughts? What kind of comes up for you? Do you have things that you find inspire you while you're there?
I'm inspired every day that I work at the cottage. It's such a beautiful location, and I'm always struck every single day when I drive in at the beauty of the place, and also that there are just so few people in the world who get the opportunity to steward a place that Lincoln lived, and it just feels so special. And I feel incredibly lucky to get to do the work. But I think the thing that inspires me and the thing that I think connects me to Lincoln is that we were both born in Kentucky. Grew up in
Oh,
Kentucky, and I often think about Lincoln and how he perceived his rise, as he kind of referred to it, his trajectory as someone
mm,
who grew up on a farm in rural Kentucky on the frontier, and made his way to the presidency eventually. I have no hopes of running for office,
It'd be
unlike
great,
Lincoln.
Cameron. It'd be great.
So,
you would be
this
great.
was, believe it or not, this was not me announcing my candidacy. But I often think about that idea of being an outsider, that I think Lincoln was always kind of confronted with while he was living in Washington. And Callie mentioned how homes are such intimate spaces, and then, you know, regardless of where Lincoln was throughout the day and who he was talking to, he came home and was himself. So those are just
Right.
kind of some of the things that I think about at the cottage.
Yeah, such a thought to have that step away moment and be able to, eh, yes, he was still the president when he walked back into the cottage, but he wasn't active at that moment. It was like, it's time to be present in this area.
Exactly. He could be his true self.
Hmm.
Yeah, I will agree with Cameron. I think the thing that inspires me about this place is, you know, that in so many ways, the decision to move out here
Mm.
was one, I think, to really balance the personal needs of his family and also this, need. He was president of the United States. He couldn't be too far away. And I also have lived experience with grief over the death of a child and have found tremendous inspiration and community in the Lincoln story. I think that
Wow.
is, grief is so lonely and isolating, and you're often desperate to connect with people. And I think that you can connect with people of the past is something that we
Hmm.
don't often think about.
Right.
But the community and connection I've found with these people whom I will never meet,
Right.
and
Right.
the privilege to steward that part of their story in a way that hadn't really been done before. I see it as a privilege, and a real act of love. And so, I think what inspires both of us is really telling because it's deeply personal and it's about
Right.
identity. And I think that is so much of what, the visitors who come to the cottage find is this little piece and part of themselves. Um, Sometimes it's something they're looking for, and sometimes it's a complete
Right.
surprise to them. And I really love when that happens.
First, thank you for sharing that. It's so beautiful to see how both of you resonate personally and deeply. And I love both of your points that this is about identity and it's the chance to look inward. But I also love that the goal is to take what you need from the visit, whether you are walking in the door because you are a history buff, you are curious, you are focused on learning more of a story, or as I love to experience most of life, I walk in and see what finds me. Sometimes I'm just confronted by the reality of, oh, I guess I needed that message today and I'm happy to receive it. But Kelly, I also love the thought because it's so striking of we could look to the past about the things that we still don't always know how to talk about, the loss of a child, grief in general, how that has stricken all of us in so many ways in so many different forms, and that we can find comfort in something that we might not have
Yeah.
considered. Or, if this is the way that turns someone else toward history to, experience stories from a new lens, I'm all about finding another route, a secret route into what might help us kind of like heal and grow.
Absolutely. And I think that that's such an important part of what we're able to do because of the way that we, talk about Lincoln, because we have purposely taken him off the pedestal. Certainly there are so many wonderful things that Lincoln accomplished and did. And also, he was human, just like the rest of us. And I think when we just perpetuate the mythology of Lincoln, we do him a disservice and we do ourselves a disservice.
Right. We absolutely lose a bit of. I think we muddy the message. We kind of lose the general intent. Like, I'm big about literature and translation, and I think you also have to view understanding history that way as well. There are things that have changed that we understand differently, that maybe there weren't words for then, that we have to translate for today. Thinking about what people can expect when they go to the cottage, having broken down his life, his story, his legacy, what because I do think one thing that the organization does just so incredibly well is inviting conversation rather than presenting history as something finished. What do you hope visitors take away? What do you hope that they question after experiencing the cottage? And what is something that, like, someone who's planning their trip right now, what's the sales pitch?
I think one of the things, well, I think what I love so much about the cottage and the
Mhm.
stories that we tell is that, we at the cottage who work there, we hear them every single day. And there's something new that hits you every single day.
Yeah,
The stories are so layered, and we, as interpreters, go into these stories with our own feelings about what's going on in the world today, or what's going on at home, and we enter into these stories with kind of different mindsets every day. I think one of the questions, kind of conversation starters that I'm really interested in right now is about optimism. um,
hmm,
yeah, I think, our visitors, we, sometimes ask them, against all odds, what are you optimistic about? And
absolutely.
it changes from day to day whether or not the group feels comfortable talking about optimism, whether they're feeling optimistic about things at all. But the thing that I'm most optimistic about is that people continue to come to the cottage every day and
Hmm.
have those conversations.
Yeah.
I think that, Lincoln, um, had so much optimism because of, who the nation was. We're made up of individuals, who all have hopes and dreams and desires. And, at the core of that, that's kind of what we are, who we are. So
Absolutely.
optimism, I think, is the thing that I'm most curious about right now.
Oh, I think that is very important and very telling of the world writ large right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, we see visitors who come from across the country, who come from around the world, and who have various perspectives, political opinions and leanings. Um, and that's one of the real benefits, one of the many benefits we have of talking about Lincoln, is because he draws so many people in. There's something
Absolutely.
about his authenticity and who he was as an individual that I think many of us can find something to kind of grab onto.
Mhm.
So we have this kind of imperfect person, that so many people are, you know have always been curious about or always felt an affinity toward,
Right.
and that draws all these different kinds of people together, and we get to have conversations every day. So it's really just, it's wonderful work that we get
Oh,
to do.
And we talk about this a lot, but that opportunity to bring people from, all corners of the country with different lived experiences and different backgrounds, different political
mhm.
beliefs, there we don't have a lot of spaces in society to come together, across difference and in a shared experience. And I think that that is one of the things that when we think about Lincoln as a bridge and, as as someone who, like Cameron said, people, so many different people claim,
Mhm.
um, as their own. To know that those people end up on the same tour, at 11 a.m. on a random Monday and can be in conversation with each other and share this one experience. I mean, I think that that's pretty special. And I think that it's an important part of our, civic lives that we need to cultivate more. And we need more opportunities in the public to do that.
Absolutely. The kind of like third space, safe space to have thoughtful, meaningful conversations, but also to just see that we have shared appreciation. I mean, I think Lincoln is one of those examples of he's one of the presidents everyone knows, kind of no matter where you're from, his name is in the history books very specifically, very loudly. Um, so that, yeah, that has to spawn a lot of interesting, maybe not debate, but conversation. Now, as we approach America's 250th, time never feels real. I look at 250 and I'm like, should it be more time? Should it be less time? I couldn't tell you. Kind of on this same vein, I know a lot of people have complicated feelings about celebrating our nation's history. How do you encourage people to engage with our past honestly while still finding reasons for hope, reflection, and celebration?
Yeah, I mean, the story that we tell at the cottage
Mhm.
is so layered and is full of optimism, but it's also full of moments of real tragedy, of uncertainty, and so we just kind of use that as a starting point. Um, we encourage our visitors to come and engage with these stories in a kind of on a real human level. We want them to specifically think about each other, our fellow American as human beings.
Mhm.
That's kind of, we start with Lincoln, but we hope that they start there and, kind of expand out throughout their lives.
Sure.
Um, we also know that, there's there needs to be some celebration. We've made it 250 years for better or worse. Um, but we can't have a meaningful celebration or commemoration without a real reckoning of what we've been through, the harm that has been caused, um, and having a moment for um, reckoning, but also reflection.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that I think that we do really well at the cottage is we invite people to just kind of come in as they are with their different kinds of American life experiences
Right.
um, and think about it from their own perspective.
Hmm. No, that I'm letting that sit because that makes sense. Like, I I think it's kind of like my summary would be you can have it all because we have to have it. We have to see each portion. We have to recognize so we can learn. We have to reflect. But we also have to celebrate. I mean, we've been through a lot, and whatever celebration means to you or whatever you're celebrating about can be different than what someone else is celebrating about.
Absolutely. I think the kind of like commemoration that we're having at the cottage, the way that we're engaging with this story has very little to do with parades and fireworks, to be quite honest with you. We, just kind of as an example of how we've chosen to commemorate it, in just a couple of days, maybe it will have been a couple of days prior when this episode airs. We're going to be inviting people into the cottage for a story night, a storytelling night. And it's going to
Fun.
be all immigrants who have come to the country with really differing backgrounds.
Yeah.
We're going to have food from immigrant food trucks, and we're just going to kind of gather in Lincoln's living room, the drawing room, and listen to stories, which is something that Lincoln loved doing. It's also really pertinent because Lincoln's last summer at the cottage on July 4th, in 1864, he signed an act to encourage immigration, which is still the only act to encourage immigration in our nation's history. So it's tying to Lincoln and his belief and hope for the future,
Mhm.
while also recognizing that we have this incredible community around us and all of these fascinating stories that really should be celebrated. And I think those are the things that are worth celebrating right now.
I think it's so important that again, like the message from the Cottage is we're giving you a lot of lessons that you can walk away with, and we hope you walk away with the one that you need the most today. Well, listeners, if you want more information about President Lincoln's Cottage, I have all sorts of links in the episode description, so check those out. But Cameron, you have pulled together an incredible list for celebrating the 250th, and we have each taken some titles from it to share a little bit of. Could you talk about this list for me? Why am I trying? I'm just going to give it to you.
Yeah, and Callie, please jump in too. This list was really kind of curated by our staff, and we wanted to focus on books that covered themes that we are really interested in for the 250th: empathy, belonging, joy, grief. And so the books that we've chosen are, there's something for everyone, I think, in these. There's definitely something for both of my kids at 3 and 7, but also for the history lovers, for people who are really interested in poetry or plays, and for people who like contemporary fiction and historical fiction. So there's something for everyone. But what's really cool about this list is that it's just nuanced in the way that we like to tell stories. Like the list might not make sense as a 250th kind of list at first glance, but I think after you kind of think about each of them and take them for what they're offering, then it really does start to become a 250th list.
I will also add to that, part of what we talk about at the Cottage is Lincoln's love of reading, and he was a voracious reader. And so I think there's at least one title on this list that we know he read. And while I
Oh,
don't like
wow.
to put words or thoughts or ideas into Lincoln's head, I would like to think that he would really be into all of the other books on our list. So we curated it a little bit with Lincoln in mind too, thinking about the types of books that he enjoyed reading, and tried to dig deep and find some that we thought he might enjoy now too.
See, and I love that. Adding to the connection for what brings us here today to get to talk about books. We will go round and each share a title. I'll go first just so y'all can see how I'm going to go about it. But my first pick, it's no surprise to my listeners that I would go for anything graphic novel-esque. And what better could I pick than Tessa Hull's Feeding Ghosts? Now, the note from our friends at the Cottage. Hull's memoir explores generational memory, trauma, and identity, urging a reckoning with the past that shapes the present. For America 250, it models how confronting difficult histories can foster empathy and understanding across generations. It reflects the ongoing work of healing and remembering. Now, if you haven't picked up a Pulitzer Prize winning graphic memoir, Feeding Ghosts is a great place to start. This came out in 2024. It's gorgeous. It's got awards galore. I could list those and we'd be here all day. But again, it's an astonishing, deeply moving graphic memoir about 3 generations of Chinese women exploring love, grief, exile, and identity. In this acclaimed graphic memoir debut, Hulls traces the reverberations of Chinese history across those 3 generations of women in her family. Tessa's grandmother, Sun Yi, was a Shanghai journalist swept by the turmoil of the 1949 communist victory. After fleeing to Hong Kong, she wrote a best-selling memoir about her persecution and survival, then promptly had a mental breakdown which she never recovered from. Growing up with Sun Yi, Tessa watches both her mother and grandmother struggle beneath the weight of unexamined trauma and mental illness, and bolts to the most remote corners of the globe. But once she turns 50, roaming begins to feel less like freedom and more like running away. Feeding Ghosts is Tessa's homecoming, a vivid, heartbreaking journey into history that exposes the fear and trauma that haunts generations and the love that holds them together. So again, that is Feeding Ghosts by Tessa Hulls. I can help with I usually would just divert to the alphabet. So Callie, do you want to give us your first pick?
Yeah, I'll pick one that's meant a lot to me personally, and that is Joyful Anyway by Kate Bowler. It was just published earlier this year. And Kate Bowler is an academic and a historian who teaches at Duke Divinity School in North Carolina. And what I love about this book specifically is that Kate really is pushing back against our society's obsession with happiness culture. And if you've ever been through anything, any kind of tragedy or trauma, or you probably have a hard time with our culture's obsession with being happy and getting back to happy. And I think that what she does so beautifully in this book, it's part memoir. I don't think that it's necessarily a memoir, but she uses a lot of personal stories and personal examples about paradox and
Hmm.
finding joy amidst all of life's really um big challenges. And I
Yeah.
think that, the way that relates to our work at the cottage is, really about the fact that this place was, as we said, it was a home. And so it saw transcendent joy and deep sadness for the Lincoln family. And so, knowing that there can be joy even in our darkest moments, and knowing that joy is such an incredibly vulnerable emotion. I think this book really taps into joy as different from happiness, and deeper and more satisfying and much more profound than just chasing happy. So I highly recommend Joyful Anyway by Kate Bowler for people who are really just searching for joy, but not feeling like they're being met in society that's so obsessed with being happy. I think this is a
Right.
great book.
The dangerous world we live in of change the baseline to be at 100 miles an hour. Like,
Exactly. Exactly.
Cameron, how about you?
Yeah, I will kind of shift us to history for a moment,
Yeah.
which is something there's not a ton of on our list, believe it or not. I'm going to talk about Steve Inskeep's "Differ We Must," which is a book about different people that Lincoln encountered over the course of his career, and how each person brought with them a very different perspective that often challenged Lincoln's views and pushed him further into deeper empathy, further into curiosity about others' perspectives, further into introspection and how might he need to change to meet the moment. There are people on the list like Frederick Douglass, but also Lincoln's wife Mary is on the list. Joshua Speed, someone he had a very close relationship with throughout his life. All of these people brought to Lincoln very different points of view. And one of the things that I think, Callie, well, maybe I will speak for you a little bit. I think we both really appreciate about Lincoln is that he was always seeking different opinions. He didn't um, always think that he had the right answer. And that's why he's one of our favorite presidents, I think, is that he had this sense of humility. Um, that was driven by curiosity, and he knew that he didn't know everything.
Yeah.
So yeah, "Differ We Must" is a really interesting kind of different view of a timeline of Lincoln's life and all the different people that he met along the way. And it really almost mirrors the tour that we lead at the cottage. During the tour, we tell stories of people that Lincoln encountered, and how he sought their opinions. People who were living in contraband camps, wounded soldiers, um, the soldiers who were camped out on his lawn in front of the cottage. Just a variety of different people, friends and foes, and I think all of those perspectives helped Lincoln really hone his ideas and you know push him towards the Emancipation Proclamation ultimately.
Absolutely. I appreciate this list as I'm like looking at my next pick because it is so varied. And I feel like you could have a unique reading experience just to go down the line. Because I'm thinking of my next pick, A Manual for Cleaning Women by Lucia Berlin. It's that idea of just like, oh, why didn't I hear about that? And why didn't I like why don't I know more anyway? So Berlin's stories center overlooked lives, illuminating humanity's struggle and moments of quiet joy. For America 250, they affirm the dignity of everyday experiences and encourage empathy across class and circumstance. They remind us that the American story is built from many, often unseen lives. I'm also a sucker for a good cover. Like it gets you right away. Like, you know what this is about, but it compiles the best work of the legendary short story writer, Lucia Berlin. If you love a short story, I'm a sucker for a good collection. It's a great way to sample and kind of get a taste for someone new. But with the grit of Raymond Carver, the humor of Grace Paley, and a blend of wit and melancholy all her own, Berlin crafts miracles from the everyday, uncovering moments of grace in the laundromats and halfway houses of the American Southwest, in the homes of the Bay Area upper class, among switchboard operators and struggling mothers, hitchhikers, and bad Christians. Readers will revel in this remarkable collection from a master of form and wonder how they'd ever overlooked her in the first place. So even in the book description, I am seen. I want to know why I didn't hear about this sooner, and I was so happy to pick it up.
That's wonderful. I much like you, one that I didn't pick up until maybe a little bit later. If I can share another pick
Yeah, please.
of mine is "You Better Be Lightning" by Andrea Gibson. And I was really sorry that I didn't come to this book until after Andrea died. And was just so struck. You know, Lincoln loved poetry and he loved reading poetry. And so we really wanted a book of poetry for this list. And a colleague suggested this one. And I had recently read it. And, just loved the way that Andrea wrote from such a vulnerable personal space about issues that are so important, the LGBTQ plus community, about social and political issues. And I loved that, you can pick up this book and find a poem about, love and outer space. It's so varied and so personal and so vulnerable and human. And I think
Mhm.
it was perfect for this list for all of those reasons. And, also as we think at the cottage, we call the cottage a home for brave ideas for the work that Lincoln did here and the
Mm.
work that we invite people into today. And this collection of poems and really all of Andrea's work, I think really is just, a perfect demonstration of bold, brave ideas. And I'm so happy that we included it on this list. I also think, it's really important to us in our 250 work to, uplift some of the voices and stories that are often left out of the national narrative.
Mhm.
And that's, again, I think, what this collection of poems really does is that it shares stories that are often excluded from what we think about as being
Mhm.
quote unquote American or a part of the national narrative that we tend to uplift. And so I'm really thrilled that You Better Be Lightning is on this list and highly encourage people to pick it up.
It's an exciting title to have as well, because I often soapbox on this podcast about how when you're in a slump, when you need something different, like when you just need to shake up your life of reading a little bit, you should try a different form or format. And a lot of people default that to meaning graphic novels or audiobooks, but it could also be switching from prose to poetry. And I think a poetry collection can also be incredibly digestible. It will challenge you in ways you didn't think it could, but it's a really great way to kind of turn your brain around and try something new.
I also, Joe, I love that because that is often what poetry is for me. It's something that I'll pick up when I'm, as you said, in a slump or been reading,
Mhm.
too many of one specific kind of genre.
Yep.
And what I love about Andrea's work, is that, they make a big deal about how poetry should be accessible for people who, you know, go to college, and it should be accessible to everyone. And I think that's honestly why I had avoided poetry for so long, is I thought, like, I don't understand a lot of it, and I don't necessarily get it. They're so deep, and they are so incredibly
Mhm.
accessible. And even if I don't identify with the exact thing that they're talking about in a specific piece, I identify with the feeling or the emotion that they're bringing up and can apply it to another, event or another thing in my own life. And it just feels so relatable, which I think is really unique and really special.
It takes us back to the like in translation portion that sometimes we have to see how someone else feels about a situation we may not be able to resonate with or match A to A, but to be able to go like, oh, but that helped me understand this completely unrelated part of myself. Cameron, you have another pick for us?
Yeah, yeah. I was just in thinking
Oh
about
yeah.
poetry. Yeah, just the idea that Lincoln, was not, he had no formal education. He had about a year of formal education. And I'm, very curious about that barrier to entry that he might have encountered, though I don't know that he ever ever really had a barrier to entry. He was such a voracious reader. But he often wrote poetry. He
Oh.
summarized his own experiences in poetry, in fables, and just picked up really everything that he could. But when he was a young man and he was um, going county to county in Illinois, he would often pack with him a copy of Macbeth. So Callie mentioned earlier that we chose one item on the list that was something that we know that Lincoln read. And Lincoln often expressed that he read a lot of Shakespeare. He mentioned, King Lear, but that Macbeth was the one that he came back to over and over. He said that nothing else could kind of compare to that. Um, I recently, rewatched a version of it that the Folger Shakespeare Library here in DC put on, and was just struck that like how relevant
Yeah.
this story is, and that it was relevant for Lincoln, but that it continues to be relevant for us today. And I'm also kind of like thinking about that barrier to entry for Shakespeare too. Like I think sometimes Shakespeare can feel, like a little bit untouchable. The language is like what it is and can be kind of difficult to parse. And um, but every single person can identify with the idea of moral failing
Mhm.
and being given an opportunity to make a decision,
Right.
and making the selfish decision. This one, is a little bit of on the extreme side than our kind of day to day choices that we might make. But
Yeah.
it's been there for every generation since. It was there for Lincoln. It's there for us today as kind of a roadmap to think about power
Mhm.
and what happens when um, political systems, systems of government operate without humanity at the center
Mhm.
and at
Mhm.
the core. It's
Right.
real. It's a really scary,
Yeah.
proposition.
Right. The two things that came up for me while you were sharing, the first being like Lincoln was writing his own poetry. And I think sometimes we need that reminder of like, we can all have our day jobs and we need to make time for hobbies. Like we have to take time. You can write fables and short stories and poems and have no goal. It could just be the action of writing. Like we talked about in our mental health episode about how making time for self-care doesn't just mean like
Mhm.
doing face masks and sitting in a bubble bath. Like if you want to write. If you want to code a pixel video game, like do it, go for it. But that comes to me of like a person who is so busy. How do you think he's processing all of that information by putting some of the energy out elsewhere.
Absolutely. And I also, you might have noticed, didn't say that Lincoln wrote wonderful poetry,
Right.
but he did. But he did write it. But yeah, it's so true. I mean, we work in the field of history, and I know that both of us leave our day jobs and have other passions that kind of like help us shed some of the work that we've been working on all day. It can be, especially in this time, it talking about the past can be a little bit difficult.
I can't even imagine. And the other thing I was thinking of is Macbeth still may feel inaccessible, but look for those recorded versions, but also look for the books that are modern retellings, because that's the beautiful thing we're in the midst of now, that there is, 1,000 Jane Austen retellings and, Margot Robbie in quote, Wuthering Heights. Like we have
Right.
versions for everything. So sometimes maybe the best way for you is to find another way in.
Absolutely.
Now, I think we have time for each one more. So, my last pick, the title alone got me. This is Separation of Church and Hate by John Fugelsang. Fugelsang calls for a more compassionate and inclusive public life, grounded in ethical responsibility and empathy. Within A250, it sparks reflection on identity, belief, and how we live alongside difference. It encourages civic engagement rooted in respect rather than division. And that really stood out to me when I read that. I had to pick this title up. And then the tagline, A Sane Person's Guide to Taking Back the Bible from Fundamentalists, Fascists, and Flock Policing Frauds, really sold me on it. This came out September of 2025. And I definitely would encourage you to check it out if you want some satire, if you want some tongue in cheek takedowns of some nonsense. For more than 2 centuries, the United States Constitution has given us the right to a society where church and state exist independently. But Christianity has been hijacked by far right groups and politicians who seek to impose their narrow views on government, often to justify oppressive and unequal policies. The extremists who weaponize the Bible for earthly power aren't actually on the side of Jesus, and historically, they never have been. How do we fight back against those acting literally in bad faith? Comedian and broadcaster John Fugelsang finally offers the answers. In this informative, perspective shifting book, Fugelsang takes readers through common fundamentalist arguments on abortion, immigration, LGBTQ plus rights, and more, exposing their hypocrisy and inaccuracy, tried to combine those together, through scripture, common sense, and deeply inappropriate humor. It offers practical tips on how to debate your loved one, coworker, or neighbor on the issues that divide us, using the Bible they claim to follow. But Fugelsang's message is about more than just taking down hypocrites. It's about fighting for love, mercy, and service that are supposed to make up the heart of Christianity. Told with Fugelsang's trademark blend of radical honesty, comedy, and deep political and religious knowledge, Separation of Church and Hate is a book every American needs today. It's a rallying cry for compassion and clarity for anyone of any faith who's sick of religion being used as a cloaking device for hate. I think this book is great to check out, regardless of your beliefs and your thoughts. I think it's just, again, it's an important perspective from yet another voice inside.
We were really looking to include political satire in there in some way, because Lincoln really, it was something he looked to a lot. And, Lincoln could also be a little irreverent. And so that book was written with a fair amount of irreverence and honesty about things that were deeply important to Lincoln. Faith, spiritual growth, not necessarily religion, but faith, certainly. And satire, it made it the perfect choice, we thought, for to include on this list.
With a title like that, how do you not dive in? Callie, what's your last
Well,
pick
I'm
for
going to
us?
cheat, Joe, and I'm going to share
Please.
two, but one very briefly. The one
Yeah.
I'm not going to focus on, but is on the list, and probably one of my favorites and one of the best books I have ever read, hands down, is James by Percival Everett. This is an incredible reimagining of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, told from the perspective of the enslaved character Jim. who, in I think an ultimate act of agency, renames himself James. I could tear up. I am tearing up talking about this story. It was such an incredible book, and I just want to, put a pin on that for anybody who hasn't read it. I highly encourage you to read it. It is a book. Again, this is fraught for a number of reasons, and I'm breaking all of my own rules by putting these words into Lincoln's mouth. But I think it is a book that he would have just really, really loved deeply. It's so well written and it's beautiful. The book, though, that I am going to use as my last pick, because I do want to highlight a children's book that is on our list, because there is literally something for everybody, is a book about grief called Everywhere Still by M.H. Clark. In my personal life, I have, looked to children's literature often in my career as to help find language for things, whether it's historical issues or events that I was having trouble, kind of comprehending myself. And so I would go to a children's book, or, really just looking for language on how to talk about something that really defies understanding, like death and grief. And this is a book that I have read over and over and over again with my living son, whose everyday life, is he encounters grief. And I just think it's a beautiful book for children that reminds us that the love that we share with the person or thing that we have lost and are missing, that love remains and keeps us connected to that person forever and always. And that even if they are not present with us, they remain in our hearts, and we are always connected by this deep love. I think it reminds us that love endures and can deepen empathy and can really, help shape our personal and civic lives. So I think it's a really important book for children and for adults who are maybe struggling with, how to live with loss, or need that reminder that the love endures and really connects us over time and space.
Absolutely. That blends so well with, I love to encourage people to try middle grade and YA when they're trying to break into a new genre. And I
Mhm.
think this is the exact same thing. When I think, like, if we can explain it to kids, we should be able to take it in ourselves as well, no matter how hard the topic may be. And I think it's such a great idea to encourage folks to check out a picture book, check out a juvenile title, and just
Yeah, I
see
will
where you're
also add
processing
about
things
this
at.
one, the images are beautiful. So that's another added plus to this book.
Added bonus left and right.
I'm also thinking about children's books, Callie, and this one's for a little bit of an older group, but I'm thinking about the book Wonder by R.J. Palacio. Um, and just that, as adults, we can look back on these stories and really gain a lot about how to treat one another. This is a book that obviously deals a lot with bullying, but it also deals with friendship and making the right choice in how we treat each other. So it's a book about humanity, um, but it's so, I think often when we think about big ideas like democracy, when we're thinking about America's 250th, we neglect these individual day-to-day human connection moments that really make up our communities, right? And Wonder is such a lovely example. I think it's a good one to, if you're a parent, I think it's a good one to read with your young ones. It's going to be familiar to them, this idea of othering, um, of having uncomfortable conversations, of not knowing the right thing to do, um, trying to figure out how to fit in. It's a reminder that we're all just doing this for the very first time. We're all having these relationships for the first time, and I love that there's a layer of grace that's tied in through this book, that some of the characters, they do make a wrong choice. They're selfish, and they choose to kind of like defend themselves by not being friends with Augie, the main character. But then they change their minds and they see things through Augie's perspective, and they become friends with Augie again. So I think this idea of grace, especially as adults, I think we don't give it to ourselves or one another nearly enough. And the idea that we can admit when we're wrong and change. It's really, really important. And it's such a simple concept. But even I think as adults, I think Wonder's a great revisit.
Absolutely. I think sometimes the lessons we seem to be missing the most of are the simplest ones. Well, Callie, Cameron, thank you so much for being here today. Before I let you both go, anything else you'd like to plug, promote, let the folks know?
Callie, do you want to talk about tours?
Yeah, I would just invite everyone to visit President Lincoln's Cottage. Again, we're located in Washington, D.C. We do tours every day of the week from Sunday through Saturday, and you can visit us on our website, lincolncottage.org. And for those who may not be coming to DC anytime soon, we also have a podcast called Q&A that takes real visitors' questions that people have asked us on a tour that we wish we could spend the whole hour of the tour answering, but we can't. And so we really go down the rabbit hole on some great questions from, visitors old and young alike.
Incredible. Well, folks, all of that will be linked in the episode description. Thank you both so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Thank you, Joe, so much. And thank you for the work that you do.
Absolutely. And friends, thank you for listening to this episode. Happy reading.
You can sample and borrow the books from today's episode in the Libby app, or if you're a librarian, find them for purchase in OverDrive Marketplace. Book Lounge by Libby is a proud Evergreen Podcast signature program. Explore more amazing shows at evergreenpodcasts.com. This podcast is produced and recorded by me, Joe Skelly, with editing by Andrew Alonso. Our theme music is High Five by Rex Banner, used with permission. Book Lounge by Libby is presented by the Libby app. Learn more at libbylife.com/booklounge.